After successful protests in which peaceful demonstrators were met with violence in the spring of 1963, President John F. Kennedy went on national television to announce that civil rights was a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. JFK radically overhauled its earlier proposals that had been more lenient to the South. After violent attacks on protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, 52% of Americans deemed civil rights to be the nation's most urgent issue. Tragically, JFK was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, seen on the right here, was sworn in. He later told a joint session of Congress that no memorial or oration or eulogy could be more eloquently honor the President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. In the summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was passed, which banned segregation throughout the South. The bill was immediately met with Southern resistance. While Southern legislators publicly agreed that they must follow the Constitution, privately they agreed to not strictly enforce it. Situated in the heart of Alabama's Black Belt, Selma was home to some of the state's staunchest segregationists. This included Sheriff Jim Clark, who held bigoted opinions that blacks had very limited mental capacity and that you could only use billy clubs and guns against them because that's all they would understand. After voter registration rallies and marches were initially met with peace from law enforcement, Clark soon ordered violence against protesters. Many sources claim that Governor George Wallace, who campaigned saying that he'd break up marches, ordered the attack. March 7, 1965 is known as Black Sunday in Selma. On the right, you see on the left, you see Martin Luther King participating in a march, and on the right, you see President Obama 50 years later with prominent leader John Lewis honoring the sacrifices and achievements of Southern civil rights activists. During the brutality on Bloody Sunday in Selma, 2 white volunteers from the North were killed. When news about Selma were released to the American public later that day, Americans were outraged. 8 days later, President Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress.
Reaches into every section and state of America.
Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Johnson implored Americans to overcome bigotry and injustice. Later that summer, in 1965, the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. Before its passage, only 6.7% of eligible blacks in Mississippi were registered to vote, and only 23% in Alabama. 3 years later, those numbers climbed to 60% in both states, allowing blacks to be elected to public office. While blacks now had the law on their side, they were still met with resistance from the Jim Crow South, where segregation still remained even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. In St. Augustine, Florida, white business owners initially voted unanimously to accept Negro customers, but when prominent civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King left to go to other cities to focus on their problems, the segregation returned. In Hattiesburg, freedom schools were established to help educate black children who had previously been academically neglected, but these were met with many church bombings and many violence against the leaders. As law enforcement was legally bound to recognize the Civil Rights Act, they became less powerful against their previous segregation and oppression of blacks. As a result, Klansmen increased vigilante justice. After 3 civil rights workers went missing in Neshoba County in Mississippi, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was ordered and went to Mississippi to set up a new field office down there. The new office became crucial in the prosecution against Klansmen and other acts of racial violence after local courts refused to punish people suspected and convicted of violence. The Supreme Court, fed up with the stubbornness of Southern whites, adjusted legal doctrines accordingly. They allowed certain cases to skip federal district courts and go straight to the Supreme Court, as many civil rights cases were refusing to be heard in Southern district courts. They helped reopen public schools that had closed rather than being segregated. Justices began looking at the statistical results of how many blacks attended mixed schools before handing out their rulings. The court protected the NAACP and was often seen as its guardian.